Hey everybody, it's Matt from RideHub here, and on today's episode of Trail Physics, we're going to be looking at riding skinnies, and for that, we're going to be on Tracks from Hell here in Squamish. So Tracks from Hell is without a doubt the most notorious skinny in Squamish, and the reason is you kind of have to use it in order to get from the main Highlands parking area up into the Alice Lake riding zone, and it does have a bit of challenge to it, and as you can see, it's really long, and it is only 16 inches wide. The one advantage though is that it is only about a foot off the ground. So the consequence level here is low, but it is really intimidating if you're a more novice rider. There are a few very specific things we can work on to become better at riding skinnies, and we're gonna go over all that stuff today. So let's start with the single most difficult part of this move, which is the entrance. And then what we're gonna do is look at the 3 most common reasons people struggle to ride skinny maneuvers. So Tracks from Hell starts off with this nice, really wide and very beginner-friendly bridge. And then as we get to the end of it, it gets into a really mucky spot, and you can just spot our entrance to the actual skinny ahead of us. Now there used to be one line through this mucky section, but people seem to struggle with it, and all of a sudden we got a couple different braided lines, and this was probably one of the hardest parts of the skinny, was actually getting yourself lined up to get on it. The original line came in here, went riders left around this tree stump, and then onto the skinny bridge. One of the reasons people struggled to get on this bridge was because right here is a pretty significant root knuckle. And this would throw people's balance off, which in turn would make it really difficult for them to get up onto the skinny. Now, as we get onto this skinny, what happens in the first 10 feet is where most people struggle. And while this bump doesn't look like much, it causes a ton of people headaches. And it's one of the biggest reasons people struggle to ride this skinny. And what you'll find is a lot of people will skip this section entirely, carry their bike up onto this piece, and start from here, which in a lot of cases is way harder. Now the one real advantage to this skinny is how low to the ground it is. Yeah, it's long, but the chances of you really injuring yourself on here are quite low. For most people, the worst thing that happens is they put a foot in the muck and they got a wet foot for the rest of the ride. But what can sometimes happen is you don't put your foot in the right place, you roll or twist an ankle, and that's the end of your ride. So something else we're gonna go into today is the correct technique for dismounting. And that's just gonna make sure you stay safe. When it comes to skinnies, there are 3 main fundamental elements we really need to pay attention to. The first thing we're going to talk about is bike body separation. The second thing is your eye movement. And the third, which might not seem as intuitive, is actually braking technique. So one of the very first and most important things we teach everybody is about good bike body separation. The reason we do this is because we want to maintain stability and balance. If the front tire of the bike goes up an obstacle and I stay in the middle of the bike, my body weight is going to shift backwards, I'm no longer going to be balanced, and I'm going to feel very unstable. The idea is I have to move around on the bike forward and aft and side to side in order to maintain that stability and balance. A lot of people ride really stiff, and when they try to go up onto this skinny, the front tire goes up a bit, their body weight falls backwards a bit, all of a sudden there's no weight on the front wheel, and their steering's compromised, and they go for a tumble. So every time that front wheel starts moving up an obstacle, we need to shift our body weight forward on the bicycle to maintain stability and balance. It's probably the single most important core fundamental in all of your mountain biking. When we're doing slower speed maneuvers on the bike, we tend to have slightly more sensitive steering inputs. So for a lot of movements like skinnies and slower speed maneuvers, we're actually going to be leaning our body slightly forward into our arms. By doing this, I'm actually creating more pressure in the front tire, which is going to give me more finite control over the steering, which is really important when you're on skinnies. The second super common problem we see with riders is really poor eye movement. Now this isn't just limited to skinnies. This is everywhere on the mountain bike. So learning to move your eyes around and leverage good trail scanning is important. The challenge when you're going slower is most people tend to micromanage on what's directly in front of them. When you do that, your brain starts trying to micromanage every little thing that it sees. And the reality is your bike's gonna ride over 99% of it. Once you've spotted where you are, move your eyes to where you're going. So rolling into this, the first thing I see is this little chunk of roots. I gotta roll over here on the left. As I get to these roots, I'm snapping my eyes up and looking for the entrance of the skinny. I've now completely given up on where I am, and I'm focusing entirely on where I'm going. As I approach the beginning of the skinny and I've assessed what's here, I'm now snapping my eyes up about 30 feet because I really don't need to consider this any further. By looking ahead, it's going to help me maintain my balance. The same thing applies as I get to the turn. I spot my turn. I make sure I'm looking ahead down towards my exit. The two words I want you thinking about are now and next. And I need to be scanning my eyes between those two places frequently. So the next logical question that comes in is, how far down the trail should I be looking? And the answer is, it depends. The biggest thing that impacts that decision is how fast am I going? The reality is most people don't look far enough ahead. So practice looking a little further. It's gonna help you with that balance. Now, the third thing I mentioned, which like I said, is not really intuitive, is the idea of brake control. Now, when you're on moves like this, where you want to maintain your speed more than you actually want to slow yourself down, we're gonna use a technique called dragging your rear brake. The idea here is I'm applying just enough pressure to the rear brake so I can create some resistance in my pedal stroke. We're gonna actually try to avoid using our front brake. The reason we want to avoid the front brake is it tends to be really twitchy. It's got a lot of grab and it wants to bring the bike to a stop. When that happens, it impacts our stability and balance. It's a tiny little thing, but it makes a huge difference. The slower you're going, the more that rear brake drag is gonna help. So those are the three things. Now let's talk about what happens when something goes wrong on here so I don't hurt myself. Now, if you're riding down this skinny and all of a sudden you have to get off, the most important thing you can do is get off safely. Whenever we're gonna dismount off a low obstacle like this, we're gonna follow the 4 L's. The first is lock. The idea here is we're gonna lock our brakes. There's nothing worse than trying to get off a bike that's still rolling down the trail. So lock both your brakes to keep the bike from rolling any further. Once the bike's locked, we're then gonna look, lean, and land. Now, look sounds super intuitive, right? Just look where you're gonna fall. But the reality is we want to do one thing before that. I want to look in the direction I want to fall. Imagine this skinny had a really low consequence left exit, but a really high consequence right exit. The fact is if I'm going to fall off of this move, I'm going to look to the left. I want to fall in that direction. And by me turning my head physically in the direction I want to fall, there's a very high chance it's going to help me fall in that direction. So step one is look in the direction you want to fall. Now that doesn't guarantee that's gonna happen, but if it does, you're ready for it. Now let's say I've looked left, but unfortunately the bike starts falling right. I'm gonna turn my head in the direction that I'm falling. The idea of getting off by leaning is I'm going to be able to get away from the bike and not get caught up in it. This only works when you're really close to the ground. Otherwise, trying to fall from height and land on one leg is going to hurt, and you got a high risk of injury. So you got to consider that before you use this technique. Now, once I've leaned the bike, I'm going to land. And the idea here is I'm now going to plant my foot exactly where I decided to. From this point, if I need to throw the bike to get away from it so I don't get hurt, I can. So now the important thing to do is take the skills that I talked about here and you can practice them in a parking lot, anywhere where there's lines painted on the ground, and you can practice riding skinnies. without needing a skinny. If you take 20 minutes on every ride and you just do a little bit of slow speed maneuvering skills, you'll be amazed what it does for your stability and balance. So practice, practice, practice. And listen, thanks again for watching this episode of Trail Physics with RideHub. If you like the videos we're making, please subscribe to this channel. It helps us continue making content. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. Now it's time to put down the phone, close the computer, and go ride your bike.